Hey guys, welcome back to the Guilty as Charged podcast. Very happy to be joined by a very special guest today, Joshua Brisco, who is joining us to talk about the Chiefs, the Chargers. He works for Sports Illustrated. He works for The Athletic. Wears a bunch of hats. Josh, how are you doing today, last man?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me. And I have to give you first and foremost props for the name of the show, because I saw that on the Twitter account whenever you DM me. And I thought, you know what? If they came up with this to be the name of their show, the segment will probably be pretty good. So that props to you in that regard. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man. It was we've been around for about a little over a year now. So very happy with how things have gone. And yes, we are very grateful for some of the creative people that came up with that name for us. So, Josh, I think the natural place for us to start this conversation in terms of Chargers versus Chiefs, AFC West, is really the offensive line, because, I mean, the Chargers and the Chiefs are frankly in a very similar situation, right? Like the previous staff, or in this case, the old staff, current staff for the Chiefs, did not do a good enough job protecting their quarterbacks. So, potentially 4 new starters for the Chiefs, likely 4 new starters for the Chargers. What's the vibe with the offensive line in Kansas City right now? Obviously, they made a bunch of changes. So what can you tell us about the Chiefs offensive line?
What I can tell you is that right now there is a decent chance that the Chiefs starting 5 in week 1 would have 0 total snaps played as members of the Kansas City Chiefs, all combined. So they trade for Orlando Brown Jr. from the Ravens, right? He was mostly playing right tackle there, but he wanted to be a left tackle, got a little run at left tackle last year. The Chiefs trade for him with their first round pick. Then Joe Thuney comes to Kansas City. He actually was first, but the guard from the Patriots signs a huge deal, highest paid guard in football. So he comes to Kansas City. Second round pick Creed Humphrey is getting all of the number 1 work at center, played at Oklahoma. Really like him. I think there's a very small chance that he gets shown to be out of place this year or anytime soon. Then at right guard and right tackle, it gets even a little bit more interesting. You have Laurent Duvernay-Tardif, who opted out last year, as most people probably know. He is an actual doctor and was on the front lines in Canada fighting COVID, and he's back this year. But right now, he's behind 6th round pick Trey Smith, who's been getting the first team work at right guard. He was the guard out of Tennessee. And as much as you guys were looking at offensive linemen over the course of your draft prep, I'm sure his name came up at some point, because he was a 2nd or 3rd round talent on most people's boards, but he had blood clot issues. I think it was his sophomore year at Tennessee, but several years ago, 2 or 3 years back. Well, the Chiefs felt good about his medicals and how they could manage it and everything. So they pick him in the 6th round, and he's nasty, like in the best possible way for a guard to be. So he's been there and he's been great. And then at right tackle, it's either going to be Mike Rimmers, who played almost the whole season last year after Mitchell Schwartz got hurt. But Mike Rimmers has some back issues right now, which popped up early in camp, and that back issues, probably more serious ones, fingers crossed, knock on wood, whatever. But that's what derailed Mitch Schwartz. So Rimmers, I think, would be the guy at right tackle. But if he can't go right now, the guy who's getting the snaps behind him is opt-out rookie, redshirt rookie, as I've been calling him, Lucas Niang, who they took in the 3rd round last year from TCU. So all of that comes together to make, two very diverging paths from the Chargers perspective and from the Chiefs perspective. You can go one of 2 ways. You can say, the Chiefs have put together a nasty and also sort of schematically different offensive line than they've had in years past. That part is true. And it's either going to make Patrick Mahomes unpressurable, or there's some gambles that won't pay off. And that's going to be, I think, in all likelihood, the biggest story of the Chiefs season. Also, though, I think there's a pretty good chance that we know more or less what the answer is by like week 4. And they'll have some pretty good depth behind them if Trey Smith or Creed Humphrey ends up in over their head. I don't think they will, but it's just a very long answer, because it's been a very arduous experience this offseason as the Chiefs have totally redone their line.
Yeah, it's crazy because, like, I was doing some research for the Chargers offensive line, and it's like you really don't see wide scale changes like this. And it's happening, with the top 2 teams in the division. Of course, I'm going to bias and say that the Chargers are the 2nd team, but
I would agree with you for the record. So yeah.
Okay. we'll dive into that conversation a little bit more, but it is crazy that, these 2 teams are really just blowing up the offensive line. And, the Chargers players are all saying the right things, right? Like, it's all about communication, about trusting each other. but in ways that they're similar and different, right? The Chargers only have the one young player who's going to start.
Right.
So you're telling me that the Chiefs are potentially going to have three. So is that different in terms of building cohesion and chemistry because they have three young players, Chargers only have one? Like, what are they saying about the chemistry and cohesion aspect of it?
It's interesting. And this is a point that I got to give credit to my deputy editor on Arrowhead Report, who mentioned this on my radio show, Almost Entirely Sports, at Sports Radio 10 here in Kansas City. That's a double plug. But when I was talking to him last night, and he made this point of like, well, I mean, I think you could look at this and go, wow, all this overhaul all at once, all these guys trying to be able to mingle and to be able to sort of sync up together. What a difficult offseason. But I think, but Jordan's point was, well, actually, I mean, is there a better time to have a total overhaul and to work in the new guys and to work in the rookies than when everything is getting changed already? So everyone kind of, Joe Tooney and Orlando Brown are veterans. The other three guys I mentioned are rookies, and maybe it's Mike Rimmers who's a veteran, but you have everybody kind of starting from if not the same, a similar point, with Rimmers being the exception. So that I think was a really good point by Jordan. And then also, I mean, from what they've been talking about at camp and everything, it is just that it is working together and figuring out how to merge as a unit. But I think to some extent, again, to belabor the last point, if you have a new left tackle and a new center, and that's all you have, you still have to work on that offensive line cohesion.
Right.
You've got the guy making the calls in most cases in the center, and you have your most important lineman at your left tackle. Like, if it, just that much turnover does actually kind of uproot some of the stuff because everyone has to work to those guys. So really, I'm not that worried about them as a unit. We could see there being a few hiccups in the season once we're actually playing games, and that happens to the best of them. So so far, it's been pretty good returns on what we've seen to this point. It's also interesting, because the Chiefs' defensive line is kind of maniacal at this point, so it's made for some interesting training camp drills.
Yeah, well, that's a great transition to my next question here. Obviously, Frank Clark's legal situation is a bit up in the air.
Yeah.
I saw a clip yesterday of Chris Jones playing defensive end, and it was kind of terrifying. So what do you make of the defensive line standpoint? Frankly, I was pretty surprised that, they didn't really address the pass rusher position in the draft earlier. But then how can you say no to Creed Humphrey, who I'm a huge fan of? What's the state of the defensive line, obviously outside of the speculation of Frank Clark?
Yeah, and I just, for the record, think Clark probably does not see a suspension this season. Maybe something happens in the offseason, slow moving. So that being said, it's really interesting. And a ton of it does hinge on Clark, just the football player. Chris Jones, though, moving from defensive end or defensive tackle to predominantly, I think, defensive end. It might be a little bit of both. Steve Spagnuolo talked about that yesterday quite a bit. And he said, look, I mean, it's going to be about situations and personnel and all of that. So I think we're going to see plenty of Jones in both spaces. But I was a little bit of, I don't want to say a skeptic, because my thought has never been Chris Jones can't play defensive end. I think I've been a little bit cautious about it because it's not Madden, right? Like in Madden, if you have a deficiency somewhere, but you've got three great defensive tackles, you move the skinniest one, the defensive end, and he jumps from an 88 to a 92. And you're like, all right, this is great. This is easy. This is the magic. And I don't want to expect that of Chris Jones, but part of the reason he can move out there is because there's even more in the middle of the defensive line than there is on the edges right now. They bring in Jerron Reed, the former Seahawks defensive tackle, who's kind of a late cut. They bring him in, which also lets him move Chris Jones to the outside because he and Chris Jones play pretty much the same position, or at least Jones did previously. So you can put him next to Derek Nottie, who's sort of, the big run stuffer, not a great pass rusher, but an excellent guy to have pretty much there in the middle. And then you can rotate in, figure out when you want Chris Jones on the field. Can you put him and Jerron Reed side by side in obvious pass rushing situations? You put more speed on the edges with, Taco Charlton back on a 1-year deal. Mike Dana going into his second year out of Michigan. You find Josh Kando they drafted. I'm sort of pumping the brakes a little bit on some of those guys because I don't want to assume the ceiling of every single player. I think that is how you get into some dangerous situations where you say, well, Josh Kane, he was a 4th round pick, but he's going to be a Pro Bowler this year. Don't even worry about it. And then you wonder why your pass rush isn't as good as you want it to be halfway through the season because you overassumed what he would do. They brought back Alex Okafor also, who I think is there to prevent them from having to play someone who is not yet an NFL caliber player. But across the line, it's a very interesting unit because there is a bunch of depth and you have stars at various spots. Chris Jones, I think, is going to be the most important factor wherever he is on the line. But really, the difference on how the entire unit will look between Seattle Frank Clark and at least 2020 Chiefs Frank Clark, which is, very good and not worth the money, being the two examples there. I think that's going to end up being the biggest pendulum swing. And I really, truly do not know what to expect from him. Clark will be good on the edge. Like I think he will be good there. I don't know if he'll be as dominant as he was in the middle, but what the Chiefs are betting on is that Jaron Reed and Derek Nottie and Tershawn Wharton, an undrafted free agent from last year, all of that. Some of those guys will be 80% of Chris Jones in the middle as a unit, and that Jones will then be 90% of his former self on the edge. And maybe that raises the line altogether. So that's at least the logic. And I think it makes a decent amount of sense.
Yeah, I'm very interested to see how it pans out. And frankly, I'm so glad that we get to see this matchup earlier rather than later like we normally do. So we'll get to one more question on the defense, and then we'll kind of talk about the AFC West as a whole.
Sure.
I'm very curious to see what year 2 holds for L'Jarius Sneed.
Yeah,
I think the Chiefs really got to steal with him, and like as a whole, right? Like it goes as Patrick Mahomes and the offense goes, but to a lesser extent, I think the secondary kind of goes as Tyrann Mathieu goes, in my opinion. But now you have L'Jarius Sneed, who, if all goes well, can kind of emerge and add another playmaker back there. So where is Sneed at in his development? And then to a more broader extent, what's up with the Chiefs secondary this year?
I was on a radio show yesterday, and they asked, hey, if the season doesn't work out for the Chiefs, if they're not in the AFC Championship game again, which I think is probably the reasonable watermark.
That's the floor for sure.
I think if you are in the AFC Championship game and something weird happens, then something weird happens. If you are in the Super Bowl, you'll take it. If you win it all, it's obviously a success. But they said, if it's not a successful season for the Chiefs, what will have gone wrong? And I think it's the corners. I'm not predicting that it's going to go wrong, but I think that's where I am that's where I'm the most hesitant to say that everything is definitely going to work out. But since Spags has been in town, the corners have worked out. And L'Jarius Sneed might be the best example of that. He's a 4th-round pick who starts last year playing on the outside because Bashaud Breeland was suspended. And I am so annoyed that they let Bashaud Breeland go to the Vikings. I've said this every platform I can get. I would have brought him back in a heartbeat. The Chiefs didn't. Okay. But there's a ton of versatility among the corners they do have, and Breeland was an outside guy, as is Charvarius Ward, who will be one of the outside corners. Anyway, I digress. I'm contractually obligated at this point to mention Bashaud Breeland, though. But so Sneed starts on the outside. He breaks his collarbone. He was great before that. He comes back and then he's playing in the slot. He's blitzing out of the slot, stuff he didn't even do in college, that Spags didn't know he could do, that Sneed didn't really know he could do, but it comes out of him somehow. And he ends up being a legit playmaker. As you said, that's a huge advantage. So I think the plan right now, and this is maybe the second biggest storyline out of camp, two or three probably. O-line, D-line, and secondary, I think we've been in the right spaces in terms of what's most interesting right now. I think with what we've seen so far, that Charvarius Ward and L'Jarius Sneed will be the outside corners in your base packages, which they're going to be in 20 or 25% of the time. And then Sneed would kick into the slot and sub packages. And then you have a real battle on the outside for who gets that other spot. I would have preferred for it to be Bashaud Breeland. I'm going to not mention his name again. But now you have a competition between Mike Hughes, a former first-round pick from the Vikings. Never stayed healthy, didn't perform that well, but they've been giving him run there. DeAndre Baker, former first-round pick with the Giants, broke his leg in Week 17 with the Chiefs. Got cut after what seemed like it might have been an extortion scheme against him. Our story was bonkers. But it really seems like Hughes and Baker and maybe Rashad Fenton, who's been here for a while, former 6th-round pick, entering year 3 or 4 off the top of my head. I think it's 3, but it seems like he's been here longer than that. Anyway, those are going to be the guys competing for that other outside spot, I think. And I expect Sneed to end up going back into that very versatile sort of Swiss Army knife role where he can play in the slot. If there are injuries, if the other outside guys don't play very well, I would be comfortable with Fenton in the slot as well. But you mentioned Tyrann Mathieu. he allows you to cover up some deficiencies or also exploit other teams' weaknesses. I prefer him in the latter role because that is the way that you're finding. He's your matchup picker. Like, he's the guy that is bothering the other team because he'll find the weakness and exploit it. So I would rather him be in that role as a weapon than as a Band-Aid. And I think Tarvarius Ward and L'Jarius Sneed, and then one of those other guys will have to be the ones that step up to allow Matthew to take that sort of more weaponized role.
Yeah, and that's, I'm a huge fan of the Honey Badger. I think, the way that Houston did him was dirty. I think the way that Arizona did him was dirty. So
it
kind of sucks that he's playing so well and it has been unlocked for the Chiefs, but it is what it is. You kind of alluded to how, you view this Chargers team. I feel like there's going to be, a real big battle for second place in this division with the Chargers, Broncos, and the Las Vegas Raiders. I always want to call them the Oakland Raiders still.
It's going to be a tough habit to break, man. It really is.
But how legitimate do you view the Chargers? Like, are you thinking that all three teams are kind of be in like that 8-9, 9-8 kind of range? Or do you think this Chargers team could really be a playoff team, potentially push them for the division? How legitimate do you think the Chargers hype is right now?
I think it's legitimate. I think them being a wild card team makes a lot of sense. I don't think they're going to be at the heels of the Chiefs by week, 13 or 14, but it wouldn't surprise me if they're relatively even 5 or 6 weeks in season. I don't have the Chargers schedule, memorized. So maybe they've got a rougher start than I think. But the Chiefs have a pretty tough start to the season scheduling wise as well. So regardless of the intricacies of the first few weeks, I really do think that they're legitimate. And I think the reason, this is very simple analysis on some level. And so, I understand that if this is frustrating to people, then I just think it's true. If you took all the quarterbacks off all the AFC West rosters and you just had the rest of the rosters, I would take whichever team you could drop Justin Herbert on. That for me is how I'm handicapping the AFC West. The Chargers roster as a whole, minus the quarterback position, versus the Broncos versus the Raiders, I think would all be close enough in my mind to say, just give me the best, not even just the best quarterback situation, but by a lot in Justin Herbert. So that for me ends up being, again, it's super simplistic, and it means that I don't have to talk much about the other 52 guys on your final roster, but I genuinely believe it to be true. All of these teams, all three of the non-Chiefs teams in the AFC West, have some playmakers on both sides of the ball. They've got some pass catchers. They've got some pass rushers. There's somebody from every roster. You know what? If I had those guys and then an average roster behind it, which I think is relatively fair, and then you give me a young, up-and-coming, on the verge of elite quarterback. I say on the verge of just because it's a small sample size. I really like Herbert, though, if that hasn't been made clear. I didn't out of college. That turned around very quickly for me. But I don't know what was going on in Oregon, but they were not using him right this season.
Lots of screen passes.
Lots of screens. Really weird. But yeah, I think the Chargers roster is perfectly fine. I would say something relatively similar about the Chiefs roster as well, I think, but I just think Patrick Mahomes is head and shoulders above everybody else. And then Justin Herbert specifically in the division as well. Then Justin Herbert is a step down and then a mile ahead of Derek Carr, maybe Marcus Mariota, Drew Lock, maybe Teddy Bridgewater. It's not even a competition in my mind. So as long as he's healthy and that offensive line's able to keep him upright, I do think the Chargers are legitimate. I don't think they're going to be able to take the AFC West, though.
No, I think that's totally fair. I think this is definitely something that's going to be kind of a long-term climb towards the Chiefs. And then, I think both teams have some kind of long-term question marks, but I feel comfortable with the Chargers floor. I feel like, 9 wins is relatively a safe prediction for this team. That's 9-8, which is another adjustment that is super weird.
Yes.
But there are a lot of other things that have to go the Chargers' way for them to really push the Chiefs. Most importantly, Derwin James and Joey Bosa have to play a full season together, or at least relatively close, because they've only played 6 games together, which is, just a travesty. But I do feel comfortable.
I didn't know that. That's incredible.
Yeah, because Derwin missed all of 2020.
Yeah.
And the year before that, 2019, he only played 5 games, and Bosa was only active in 2 of those games. And then in 2018, Bosa missed 12 games that year. So yeah, it's been frustrating. Obviously, we've got a wait and see approach with the coaching staff, but I feel like if those three things happen right, Herbert kind of takes another step, offensive line comes together, Bosa and Derwin stay healthy, I think the Chargers can absolutely push for a wild card spot, potentially more. But again, we have to kind of wait and see in terms of how legitimate the push towards the Chiefs is, at least in year one.
And that's the other thing about it is like you very clearly have long-term stability. So it's going to be really interesting. And this is why I imagine like it should be important to you guys how the Chiefs last 2 draft classes pan out, right? Like, because eventually it's going to get to a point where Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce aren't Chiefs and Justin Herbert should still be a Charger at that point. How do the Chargers reload up? And then what do the Chiefs do once they start getting to the decline of those guys? Now, look, that's probably 4 or 5 years out. So it's a very, very long game there. But the other thing is that if you have the quarterback and you get a wild card spot, crazy stuff happens. Great quarterbacks make playoff games fun, like and make everything uncertain. You get a great Justin Herbert playoff performance, which the goal for the Chargers, I think you should again be happy if it's a decent wild card spot. Get that wild card spot, get into a playoff game, and then see what Justin Herbert can do. And I think he could do a lot in that role, assuming that you have some health on the defensive side of things. If Keenan Allen stays healthy also, which I know, I mean, again, so far so good through camp, right? Again, knock on wood. Like usually it feels like the Chargers have like 3 season-ending injuries by August 5th. So hopefully that doesn't rear its ugly head for you guys anytime soon. But yeah, I would be very optimistic about what the Chargers are building right now because they have the quarterback.
Yeah, absolutely right there with you. So we'll get you out of here on this last question. Where do you land on predicting the Chiefs record this year? Obviously, you kind of talked about the AFC Championship game kind of being the floor. Are you seeing 14 wins again, 13? Kind of what's your prediction process for the Chiefs this year?
Yeah, I went through the whole schedule right after it came out, and honestly, I haven't gone back to it again yet. But I think I was in the 13 range. That's 4 losses now, and it might not even be that many. The only thing that really matters is getting the first round bye, which is only now to that number 1 overall seed, as was the case last year as well.
Yeah,
that's where everything lives and dies. If the difference between being a 2 seed, you want to have the home field advantage, that's all great, but to have the first round bye, that not only means you can't lose, which is important because even the Chiefs could get upset in a playoff game. A Chiefs Chargers wild card game, I would not want to see that if the Chargers are fully healthy, right? Like
that'd be so fun.
But it would also be very fun. But you want to avoid that game and also be able to rest up through that game as well. So I think right now I definitely pencil them in to be the team that wins the number 1 overall seed out of the AFC, that outpaces the Bills and the Ravens. And that's the most important thing for me. Now the Chiefs have to win the games against those teams. You want to preserve those tiebreakers and all. But if they can win those games and then just basically need the tie on again, let's assume the Bills and Ravens and perhaps the Browns, so the Chiefs open the season with, the Chiefs could kind of put some dirt on the Browns in week 1 as a number 1 seed, not as a playoff team, but just as the 1 seed. That would also be a whole lot of fun. So yeah, I think they win. I think they win 13 or 14 games, and maybe once again in the last week of the season, the starters can rest, or even if they don't, if that game is for the number 1 seed, that would very much be worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree there. Josh, this has been great, man. Chargers fans, if you want some Chiefs intel, which I know is always super important throughout the season, make sure and follow Josh on Twitter at JB Brisco. Check his workout for Sports Illustrated as well as The Athletic. Josh, thanks for joining me, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime, if you want to do a little preview ahead of the games, you let me know, and I'll see if your guys' roster is hopefully this time stayed healthy and we can get a full strength sort of battle with the Titans.
Yeah, absolutely, man. We will definitely be interested in that, and we'll be in touch.
Sounds good. I'll talk to you soon then.
Have a good one, man.